Okay, so I wanted to make a video demonstrating how we use the Teamworks platform with the women's basketball program here at the University of South Alabama to both design and deliver a recovery questionnaire to our athletes. So the overarching goal of using a recovery questionnaire in general is to quantify an athlete's stress recovery state over both what we call an acute and chronic period of time. So both the short and the long term. Now, granted, while it's very much a subjective tool, it can nevertheless assist in taking the guessing game out of trying to figure out how athletes are responding to not only the physical and what we call psycho-emotional stressors of their sport, but also of their daily lives as well. So where it may lack as an objective measure, recovery questionnaires in general very much succeed in quantifying all of the stress encompassing an athlete's life. Okay, so the specific questionnaire that we use and we've used for the past year is called the Recovery Stress Questionnaire, and for short, that's called the RESTQ. Okay, a little background on this questionnaire before we kind of dive into this. It was published in 1995 by Michael Kellman and Wolfgang Kallis, and these guys are the ones who proposed this model. And there are a few different variations of this questionnaire. The complete questionnaire exists as either a 76-item form or a 52-item form. Okay, and they're also known as the REST 76 and the REST 52, respectively. However, the version that I'm using is modified and condensed even more, and it exists as a 24-item form. So the name of that then is called the RESTQ-Sport. So that's what it's been called. Now what you're looking at here is a Microsoft Excel version of kind of how I built it out within Excel of the questionnaire itself. And as you can see, we have the 24 items here on the screen. On the left, they're broken down into different categories. I've kind of color-coded the two overarching categories as a red category, which represents the stress questions, and then the green category, which represents the recovery questionnaires, or the recovery questions, excuse me. So in total, there are 12 of each. So 24 total questions, 12 recovery questions, and then 12 stress questions. Now, within those two broad categories, there are two subsections. So within each stress category, there are 6 questions devoted to a general stress subject matter, and then there are 6 devoted to a sport-specific stress category. So, for example, a general stress question is, I did not get enough sleep, okay? While a sport-specific question would be, my muscles felt stiff or tense during my recent performances. So that's the difference between general and then sport-specific. And similarly, the same applies to the recovery questions. So 6 of the recovery questionnaires are very sport-specific, and then 6 fall more into a broad or general category. So examples of those would be general, I slept peacefully and relaxed, whereas a sport-specific recovery was I was convinced that I trained well. Okay, so that's how it's broken down. Now over here to the right, I've designated, or how it's designated is that each placeholder, depending on how it's being answered, represents a different numerical form. So ranging from 0 to 6 points, from never all the way to always. So this is just a basic Likert scale type questionnaire. Now, if it's a stress question, whatever the answer is, numerically, it's going to be negative, with the exception of 0, obviously. And then likewise, with the recovery questions, those are going to be positive. So at the bottom, what happens after the questionnaire is completed, there is a tally of the total stress score, which is the summated scores of all of the red questions. And then below that, we have the total recovery score, which is the summated version of all of the recovery questions. Okay. And then here on the bottom, we simply take the difference. Okay, so we take whatever the stress score is, whatever the recovery score is, add them together. Okay, and that's going to be the stress recovery balance. And this is the number, the singular number, that's going to represent more or less a snapshot of a certain athlete's recovery state, right? It's an arbitrary unit, but it gains significance the more trials you have. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is the original form that I built out in Excel. Now, again, the topic of this video is how we build it into the Teamworks platform. So I'm going to pull up Teamworks, and in Teamworks, there's an option for forms, and you can do a lot of different things with forms. And of course, you can build out each question of this recovery questionnaire into this form in Teamworks, and it's really simple. Teamworks is super user-friendly, and they give you a lot of flexibility in what kind of form you want to develop and how you want it answered. So for example, and I'm not going to scroll down this whole thing, but here's the first item, right? I did not get enough sleep, and you have all of your options here. Okay, if I want to add another option, you can add an option, okay? And then always select required. So it forces the user to answer that question before moving on to the next, okay? And so all 24 questions are here. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, okay? But after you build out your questionnaire, you get to assign it to different athletes or different users within Teamworks. You could even set a routine schedule. So right now, since we're in the middle of our competitive season, I'm having my athletes complete the questionnaire 3 times a week. Ideally, you do it every day, but for practicality purposes, I'm having them doing it Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday, strategically around our game schedule. So 3 times a week, and that's how I've set it up. But I've talked to other people and other coaches and professionals. Some do it more, some do it less. I've just found this works for us. Okay, so this is how you build the questionnaire. Pretty simple. Obviously, you want it to be multiple choice, but you have different types of forms for different types of questionnaires. Some questionnaires will have a comment box where they can comment at the bottom. That's not an option I've given them for this specific questionnaire. But that's something you could potentially look at if you want to add a comment box at the bottom for them to further explain why they chose what they chose. Okay, so after the form is built and it's scheduled and you're starting to receive the responses, you'll go into forms, okay, and then manage forms over here to the right, and it's going to populate all of the forms that you've built and assigned. And as you can see here, these are all the recovery questionnaires that I've made. And it's on a schedule. It has the date and then the assigned date, okay? So what I'm going to do is click on results for the one today, for example. All right. And if I scroll down, it's going to display each athlete by name and then the option to pull up each athlete's answers. So for the purposes of this video, I've set out to kind of de-identify each of my athletes' names for obvious reasons. So I'm not going to scroll down to show the names, but what you can do is export to Excel, and this is going to take all of the data and export it all to an Excel file where we can then run different things with the data. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to click on that button. Okay, it's gonna pull up, okay, a simple Excel file with all of the raw data. Okay, so we have the completion date here, the completer, as in the name, and again, I've de-identified all of my players' names. So for the purposes of this video, it's just 1 through 14, and then each column represents a different item on the questionnaire. So there are going to be 24 subsequent columns as you scroll over to the right, and then these are all of their verbal responses to each of the questions. So what I'm going to do is copy this data and then paste it to a separate Excel file that I've created and called an export file. And what we're going to do is paste it in here. Okay. And the point of this is to export the data and convert the verbal responses into quantifiable data. So taking the answers as sometimes, often, more often, so on and so forth, to actual numerical information, which is then usable. Because as it stands as verbal data, on the whole, it's not very usable from a tracking standpoint. So I've included some data export instructions here at the bottom. It's pretty simple and it's already built out, and I can probably attach this to my post later. First step is copy and paste the data from the Teamworks exported document into cell A1, which I've just done. It's important, the way that I've built it out, that you want to include the header row. Okay, so copy it just as it was. Okay, and then you're going to click on here in step 2, the initiate data conversion button. And what this is a macro enabled button which follows a series of steps automatically that converts each of these verbal points into a number, which we can then measure. All right, so step 2, I'm going to click data or initiate data conversion, and what it's going to do is pop me over to this step 2, where I can then retrieve the data numerically and then export it. Okay, so I'm going to click on this button, and it's going to shoot me over here. Okay. This yellow column is all of the numerical data that represents the stress recovery balance or score for each of the players, and it does it automatically with literally one click of a button. So on the back end, you can see this big chart here at the bottom sifts through all of the verbal responses up here and assigns a numerical value, tallies it, and then summates it over here. Okay, so what I do is, this is kind of a middleman, so to speak, this data export file. So I'm going to copy this over, okay, Control C to copy, and then I'm going to pull up my athlete monitoring spreadsheet that I've built out, and it has a bunch of different metrics as well, and I'll go over that in another video here soon. But here, as I scroll over to my wellness score, and it's for the date, so today's date is February 20th for each of my players. I'm going to paste it where it says RESTQ-Sport, okay, and just paste the data. Boom, there we have it, okay. And this has some secondary order calculations that you'll see in a minute. Okay, so the data's there. I'm going to refresh the data in my spreadsheet. And then I'm going to come over to my RESTQ dashboard, right? And this is where all of the data is displayed in a graphical fashion, okay? We have these different slicers that select different pieces of the data and make it easier to view. So like I said earlier, the 3 days are selected, which I've assigned questionnaires, so Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday. So those are the only days that are going to be populated on this graph. And then the different weeks as well. So I have 5 or 6 weeks going into the past, so we can start to see some trends as we move through time. Okay, and then the most important one here is the athlete slicer, and here we can choose to see the graph for each of the athletes, right? And this is just basic pivot table functionality here. Okay, so player 3, we can see the general trends. Now again, these numbers represent more or less arbitrary units in and of themselves. They don't have a whole lot of relative or statistical significance, but as you go through time, you get to see general trends in their score. Okay, so these are the raw scores. As you can see here, on February 17th, player 3 scored a 33, which is relatively high compared to her past, right? And then today she scored pretty low, okay, a -3. So we know that is probably significant. All right. To answer that question even further, though, what I've done is taken that same data and I've standardized it into a z-score. So now we're looking not at the raw data, but at the deviation from the mean. And then we get to start talking about having the discussion of, okay, what is statistically significant? Is this drop mean anything, or is it really just, can we just chalk it up to natural variations in their responding, right? So basically Z-score functions is, we look at how many standard deviations away from the average, and I've set, two kind of parameters here. The green line is one standard deviation above the average, and then probably more importantly is the red line, which is one standard deviation below. Okay, so what we suspect up here when we see these low scores, at least in this player's case, we get to confirm that, okay, this is perhaps statistically significant to some extent based on the fact that, on February 1st, she scored, almost, or it looks like well above negative 1.5 standard deviations below what she typically scores. So that should open the eyes and start the discussion with the athlete and potentially with the coaches. Okay, what can we do to facilitate this athlete's recovery a little bit better, right? Looks like over here she's approaching, 0.5 to 1 standard deviation. And then here again today, again, dipping down negative 1 standard deviations below. Okay, so a lot of times this data confirms what we anecdotally see with our own eyes, but it can be used as data to drive discussions with both coaches and the athlete. Okay, and you could do this by toggling between different players so we can see, where each athlete is at on a daily basis. Okay, so again, this is what I've called the RESTQ dashboard, and it's the way that I deliver, or collect, I should say, and then deliver data to my coaches on a daily and weekly basis. And again, I use it to drive discussions on how are we managing recovery of our high-minute players. For example, what can we do proactively and preemptively to mitigate, I should say, the chance of having, let's say, a low score. Okay, so very valuable information if it's used properly in a way that the data is simplified and delivered to the coaches in a meaningful way. Last thing I'll say about that is the coaches, could look at these numbers on this first graph and say, well, geez, what does 24 mean, right? But the discussion I'm having with them is, guys, let's just look at if they're approaching that red, that's potentially cause for concern. Okay, if they're approaching 1 standard deviation below their average. Okay, we'll go back to this player, for example. So we use this as the coaches see, okay, they're below the red. They can look at it within 5 seconds and see, okay, maybe that's cause for concern to some extent, right? Whereas the numbers are more or less arbitrary. So I put more weight, more value on these Z-score charts than I do even the raw data. But both, they complement each other well. So in general, this is how we use the TeamWorks platform to design, schedule, deliver, and then export data from the TeamWorks platform into an Excel file, into a dashboard, and then on the coach's desk either that same day, that afternoon, ready to have a discussion.